and launch into our historic happy hour, our detour from Chicago to the Indiana Dunes and the homes of tomorrow. On that note, I am going to mute everybody for the duration of our session here, just to make sure we cut down on background noise, that sort of stuff. But you can always keep saying hello in the group chat, which I'll say hello, just in case you hadn't already opened that up, saying hello once again in there, so you get that little push notification. I've got a presentation. We'll use Google Maps a little bit, and we'll do our best to virtually explore this wonderful wilderness right down the lakefront from Chicago. So let me go ahead and introduce myself and Chicago Detours really quickly. My name is Alex Bean. I'm a big history nerd. I got some of that out of my system getting my master's at the University of Chicago. I also teach at the City Colleges of Chicago, and I do a lot of the writing and blogging for Chicago Detours, which is, of course, the company that's bringing you this trip down to the dunes this evening. Chicago Detours celebrating its 10th anniversary this summer. We expected to be doing special events, walking tours, bus tours, sometimes boat tours like we normally do, but things being what they are, we've been having a lot of fun doing these virtual tours for the past couple of months here. And as I've been saying, this gives us an opportunity to do things, explore places and ideas that wouldn't have been possible in a regular physical in-person tour format. I mean, I'm sure there are tour groups that go down to the dunes from Chicago, but it's just not something that necessarily would have been on the table for us. So this gives us something to talk about a place, visit a place through Zoom that we might not have been able to anyways. We're happy to be able to do that. Happy to have all of you with us this evening as well. Let me go ahead at this point and launch into our share screen presentation here. You should be seeing my monitor up on screen. If you don't see that, please do let me know. Just want to make sure we're not having any technical difficulties. And I'll keep the group chat open while we're talking, just in case you've got any comments or questions. I'll do my best to respond to them either in the moment or as we reach the conclusion of the tour. Usually we like to have a little Q&A session towards the end of our time together. It looks like Jenny has a book recommendation for us. Interesting. All right. So taking a look at the maps right here, I want to give you a sense of just how close the Indiana Dunes are to Chicago. And I'm sure this is something that's probably fairly familiar to many of you. If you are from the Chicago area, you've been to the dunes, there's that little raise hand function you can do through Zoom. I get the feeling, if you feel like raising your hand to let us know you've been to the dunes, feel free to do so. I'm sure it's a lot of us. This has been maybe the most popular getaway destination for Chicagoans for over a century, and now I see several raised hands popping up on my screen. Not at all surprising, of course. I think it's the Indiana Dunes, Western Michigan, and then up into Wisconsin are the three sort of natural getaway destinations for folks in Chicago, and that makes a lot of sense. Chicago is a dense urban jungle centered right on Lake Michigan, but the other sides of Lake Michigan, further north, south, and east, they are often wonderfully beautiful, and many of them are still pristine, not necessarily untouched by humanity, but definitely more pristine than you might expect. So the Indiana Dunes here, if you know you're driving, it's maybe about an hour. You can take the metro train. You know, I bet people have taken Ubers from Chicago to the Indiana Dunes. It's just that close. And that's what makes it really remarkable. You can do a day trip out there, really see a lot of the sights, and still be falling asleep in your own bed that night, which is why it's been so popular for such a long time. Now, we'll come back to Google Maps in a couple of minutes here. There's some neat stuff I found clicking around over here that I want us to take a look at later. Let's go ahead and jump into the presentation that I had created. This is, of course, Chicago Detours. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can follow our website, all sorts of ways of keeping up with Chicago Detours. And I started off here, actually, this presentation with a little reference to something related to Chicago. The official motto of the city is Urbs in Horto. Anyone know their Latin well enough, or maybe just their Chicago Twitter, or not Chicago Twitter, you can tell how I spend my free time, their Chicago trivia well enough to be able to translate Urbs in Horto for us? Anyone know? City in the Garden, you got that. You're exactly right. When Chicago was founded way back in the 1830s, 1837 is when we officially become a city. We're incorporated by the state of Illinois. This was a vast wilderness around what's now Chicago, and it really did feel like we were a small urban center in a vast farming district. There's a famous book about Chicago called Nature's Metropolis. And a lot of Chicago's early growth and commerce was based upon the harvesting power, the commerce that comes from the hinterlands, the farmland, stuff like that. And so I think that's actually part of what makes the Indiana Dunes so special. Herbs and Horto is the city in the garden. The city has kind of eclipsed the garden in many ways in Chicago these days. We've got our wonderful parks around the city, but natural landscapes, they are not. They are cultivated landscapes, right? But the Indiana Dunes, in many ways, are still remarkably similar to what the landscape in this area around the southern shore of Lake Michigan looked like before the urban expansion of Chicago really took off. If you want to get a sense of what the Potawatomi, the Native American nation that lived in the Chicago area before European and American arrivals would have known, the Indiana Dunes gives you a strong sense of that. The other thing that always blows my mind when I think about this, the first Europeans to come through the Chicago area were French voyageurs. They paddled canoes here from Quebec. And just looking at the vast expanse of the lake here and then remembering that people paddled a canoe all the way from Quebec to Chicago using the lakes as well as the river systems, it boggles my mind every time I think about it. And I think that is something that's really remarkable, really tangible, that you have the sense of what the past space, the natural environment of this region looked like. I think it's also really cool because the city is still right there. This photograph on the right is taken from the main Dunes Beach, and you can see this massive industrial district just down the coast. Gary, Indiana is a stone's throw away. Michigan City is just to the east, the northeast, I guess, of the Indiana Dunes. It's also visible from other parts of the park. So this is a natural landscape almost pinned in. You've got Gary on the west, Michigan City on the east, the interstate, I-94, kind of straddling all of this to the south. And then you've got this wonderful expanse of prairie grasses and beaches and oversights. It's really remarkable. It feels unlike anything else in the region, I would say. And that's exactly what you can see on the map right here. There's actually two parks that make up the Indiana Dunes. There is the Indiana Dunes State Park, which is the older of these parks. That's been around since the 1920s, if I'm recalling correctly. That's when the state of Indiana turned this into a nature reserve. And then there's also the very new Indiana Dunes National Park. This is actually the only national park in the Chicago region. It only became one in the past couple of years. This has been a national lakeshore. So the National Park Service oversaw it, but it didn't have the full status of park. That has a lot to do with sort of how national parks are created. If you ever want to learn more about that, Ken Burns has a great documentary about the national parks. Your eyes will fall out of your heads with how beautiful some of the natural landscape is. But essentially, national parks in the United States have to be created by law. Congress has to pass a bill that turns a preserved area into a park. Not the easiest thing to get something through Congress. So it's only in the past couple of years that the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore was turned into the Indiana Dunes National Park. So this is an old protected space, but the park district itself is relatively new, and they're still in the process of building it up in many ways. But that does explain the two-tone shade on the lakefront here. The lighter green is the state park, the darker green is the national park. And the national park is actually not contiguous. It's got little pockets off on different parts of the district here, separated by intervening property, intervening industrial space at the Port of Indiana, smack dab in the middle there. But it is still a wonderfully preserved natural landscape here. All right. Now, like I was saying, this has been a detour from Chicago for over a century, and I couldn't help but put these wonderful posters in here for us to appreciate. The South Shore Line, which these days goes to Millennium Station in downtown Chicago. That goes all the way to South Bend, Indiana. And there are people who commute from South Bend to Chicago on a regular basis, maybe even a daily basis in normal time. But this is also a really popular way for people to get out of town for quick visits to the countryside. So you've got these wonderful old posters. They must be from the 1920s or 30s. I had a little trouble finding the exact date for them. But the Dunes Beaches, visit the Dunes Beaches, 25 miles of beach via South Shore Line. I find these posters wonderfully charming. If anybody ever rides the L in Chicago, the Quincy L stop has a couple of these because they made the Quincy stop look old-fashioned. It looks like the 1890s. And when I went last summer, Pat said commuted from Northbrook to Michigan City Clinic for 7 years. There you go. The Metro train, the South Shore Line, they still get you there. It might even be faster than taking the interstate sometimes. But this has been a spot that people have flocked to for a long, long time. And there are some very obvious reasons why. So like I was saying, still accessible by train or car. You're going to Dune Park if you hop on the South Shore Line at Millennium Station, Van Buren Street, those sorts of spots. Jenny's saying they like to catch the train at Chesterton, which is right on. And we're actually going to try and take a look at Chesterton in just a minute here as well. So easy to find it. Pat saying he drove 90 miles in 90 minutes. That is much better than the interstates can do. So it's an easy commute here by the train. There's actually a new book on this sort of topic from Belt Publishing, a sort of friend of ours based in Cleveland, but it's Chicago Transit Hikes. It's all the different natural hiking destinations that you can get to through the L or through the commuter trains like the Metro, those sorts of things. It's a really neat system, and it's a fun book to look up if you're ever interested in that, Chicago Transit Hikes. And that is, of course, one of the main pleasures, hiking the dunes. These two photos here came from the two different day trips that members of the Detour staff took to the dunes last summer, almost on the very same date. On the left is my boss Amanda's boyfriend walking through one of the trails in the dunes, and on the right is my best friend Travis and my brother-in-law Adam holding the hands of my son Harrison, who's probably watching this upstairs and very excited that he sees himself on screen here. This is one of the main pastimes in the Indiana dunes, along with the beaches. We'll get those beach views in a second here. But the dunes present a really wonderful opportunity for hiking that you don't find very often in this part of the country. You may have noticed Chicago is very flat. We got flattened by the glaciers millennia ago. But the dunes, because they collect this the soil blowing across Lake Michigan, it gets caught by the plants, settles, and then grows into the dunes. They provide much more up and down. They provide a change of scenery, a very unique ecosystem. Hiking through the dunes, it feels like you go to a whole different world. And I love the vistas that so many of these dunes trails can create. Pat asking about Saugatuck there. There are dunes in Saugatuck. There's dunes all the way up the western coast of Lake Michigan. Basically, the way dunes are created, the wind blows across Lake Michigan, usually west to east. As it blows, the soil that's been kicked up, the sediment, gets deposited when the wind slows down as it hits land. That settles right along the lakefront and leaves a pretty continuous line of dunes from northern Indiana all the way up to the northern tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. The most dramatic of them, in my opinion, is the Sleeping Bear sand dunes up near Traverse City, which I also have been to many times. I fell down that dune when I was a young child, and my family will never let me get over that. But the dunes create these beautiful vistas. You're surrounded by these scrub grasses, prairie grasses, these small trees, a vista down towards the beautiful cerulean blue of Lake Michigan right there. It's a breathtaking sort of thing. And, I grew up in the Midwest. I'm very familiar with these sites. And yet when I see these images, I just feel like running right out the door. And you see, there's such a variety of vistas. The trails kind of loop around different ridge lines in the dunes. Oftentimes they start at the campgrounds. The one I'm most familiar with starts at the Indiana State Park campground, does a big loop around various ridge lines with overlooks down onto the water, and then deposits you right back at the main dunes beach, which is also near the campground. So this provides you some nice exercise, some great views. As long as the weather is nice, it's a really fantastic way of getting out there and seeing some of Mother Nature in an area where that's not always the easiest. And this is actually quite popular even when it's not necessarily beautiful. beautiful outside. The dunes trails are still available many times a year, and especially in the fall. The colors of those trees and of the grasses, they just illuminate the shoreline in a completely different way. I didn't find a picture I fell in love with, but it is well worth visiting the dunes, even if it's not high season. Now, I do love, of course, that many of the dunes acquire names. The most famous of them is probably Mount Baldy, which is near the eastern edge of the Dunes Park. This is still in the national park, if I'm recalling correctly. It's right next to Michigan City, Indiana. And this was actually closed for a while in the past couple of years. That Mount Baldy, rather obvious. I think it's also rather obvious why I care about Mount Baldy here. But this is an open-faced sand dune looking down on Lake Michigan. It's an active sand dune. It shifts year to year based on how the wind is blowing, how the sand moves through the system. But because it was so popular, you can see there's a road right back here, and there's a parking lot right behind the dune. This was used very, very often for climbing. And that actually erodes the dunes, because as people climb, they step on the grasses and the other plants that help hold the dunes in place on the lakefront. And that led to erosion of Mount Baldy, including a couple of years ago, a really rather scary incident where a 6-year-old fell into a sinkhole in the middle of Mount Baldy. And it took 3 hours to dig this child out of the sinkhole. It was like a 12-foot cylinder in the middle of the dune there, which is, as the parent of young children, terrifying. But I'm sure we'll still have fun on this at some point in the future here. So climbing on the dunes obviously is a big favorite. Enjoying the beaches is a big favorite as well, and I feel like I don't need to enumerate the. These days, you can only visit Mount Baldy on guided tours. That's it. I was trying to find confirm that, and I had seen different information on different parts of the website there, and it's especially hard to find because everything is shut down right now due to COVID-19, so it was a little hard to find solid information there. But thank you, Kelly and Jenny, for letting us know Mount Baldy is only open for guided tours. And yeah, the dune covered the parking lot, which got getting blown further back from the lakefront there. Now, like I was saying, the beaches themselves, I feel like, don't really need me to talk about how pleasant it is to go to the beach to spend a day splashing around there. I do want to highlight, I love the beach house that's at the main dunes beach in the state park there. It is sorry about that. Sorry for any confusion. That was on my end. I don't know exactly what happened. I could tell the screen share stopped and I just went, oh no. So I'm happy to be back with all of you. All right, can everybody hear me? Everybody sees me once again? It's the first time I've had a disaster like that. And, you know, I've been doing this for nearly 3 months now. So I feel like that's actually not the worst disaster rate for the number of these that I have led. Happy to be back with all of you. Of course, let's go ahead, jump back to the dunes. So I don't know how much of this you could hear in the last minute or two there, but the site of the Dunes Beach in the Indiana State Park is where there was a French fur trading outpost back in the 16 and 1700s. The British took it over in the late 1700s, and then that was the site of a small battle in the Revolutionary War, which I never would have expected, that there was a Revolutionary War battle site 30 miles down Lake Michigan from Chicago. This was way off the grid in the Revolutionary era. I'm sure there are other battle sites, you know, in the region, but it blew my mind to discover that had happened here so close to Chicago. The other thing I found sort of interesting is right where the Indiana Dunes Beach is located today. If you've ever been to that main Indiana State Park beach, it's right in the map on the right. It's where you see this creek emptying into Lake Michigan. This was the site of a ghost town, or is the site of a ghost town. Back in the early 1800s, City West was founded on that little creek through the dunes, and they thought they were going to be the great metropolis of Lake Michigan. The famous U.S. Senator Daniel Webster, who's a really prominent Northern politician in the early 1800s, he came through here and gave a speech in City West back in, I believe, the 1830s, talking about the great promise that was here and how City West was certainly going to be one of those great spots that everybody would talk about in the new Western territories of the United States. That didn't happen. City West never really took off. But the hope was that this was going to grow as much as Chicago eventually did. If you look at the map very carefully, you can see they wanted to connect to the creek, which you can see in the photograph on the left, tiny little thing. They wanted to connect it to a canal that would have gone over to Lake Calumet and then into the Des Plaines River, the Illinois River, and the Mississippi River. They wanted to connect Lake Michigan to the Mississippi through the Indiana Dunes. If that had succeeded, we might be talking about those famous Chicago dunes in Illinois, and the name of this company might be City West Detours. Just one of those little quirks of history. It didn't quite work out, but I do always love seeing something like this. This could have easily been Chicago if Chicago hadn't gotten its canal built first. Fascinating little bits of history over there. Now, my favorite bit of history over in that region is the absolutely wonderful Homes of Tomorrow. This is in a little historical district near the eastern end of the national park, and these are 5 houses that were originally constructed as showpieces for the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, the Century of Progress exposition. The dream was that various architects, engineers, different outfits would put together model homes that people would fall in love with and would want to buy and construct in their new subdivisions, in their new neighborhoods, replacing the older housing stock in aging cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles. And so the hope was that beginning in the 1930s and on into the future, there would be millions and millions of copies of these homes that were first debuted in Chicago in 1933. That didn't wind up happening, but they did, for whatever reason, wind up getting purchased, 5 of these model homes, loaded onto a barge and floated down the Lake Michigan shoreline to Beverly Shores, Indiana, where they've been sitting on a bluff above Lake Michigan since the 1930s. Now, they have gone through some decay since the 1930s, of course, but they are absolutely wonderful to behold. I made a specific point of driving out and seeing these terrific things on my last trip last summer, because how often do you see relics from the World's Fair sitting in the middle of a national park? Not often in my experience. And Kelly's saying they have a tour of the homes every fall. It is on my list. I'm usually pretty busy leading tours, but I want to find a time to get out to the dunes and tour these homes one of these years. So you can see there's 5 different buildings. They all have different styles of architecture. Generally, most of them fit into the kind of Art Deco, streamline, art modern styles that were very popular in the early 1930s. Really leaning towards the modernist style that would take off in Chicago beginning after World War II. And I do think if not for the Depression, if not for World War II, these homes might have been mass built across the United States. That didn't wind up happening, but that does mean that there's a tremendous charm to seeing these things. This was my particular one, this wonderful pink streamlined structure that looks out over the shores of Lake Michigan. This is called the Florida home, if I'm recalling correctly. It's just pink homes. I just love the pink home, but especially this style. It looks like something from Miami got transplanted into Northwest Indiana. It's just so beautiful. And I couldn't stop chattering about these places to everybody in the Detour's office after I went out there and saw them again last fall. Now, there's a couple of them that I didn't get great photos of last summer. The sun was not at the best angle, but you can see this one was meant to be sort of a mountain resort sort of home. That has just recently been restored, if I'm recalling correctly. And then this one, the House of Tomorrow, is actually waiting for restoration. The National Park Service is trying to entice somebody to pay for restoration of this home, which they think will cost something like $3 million. But yeah, Indiana Landmarks, I think the Park Service is involved as well. They want somebody to live in this building after they pay for the renovation of it, and there'll be different incentives that are involved in this. But this one, it looks like something, I don't know, from the Jetsons, I guess. And does anyone have a guess, this platform at the top, what that was supposed to be for? It's my favorite part. No guesses? It was a helipad. 1933, they thought that people in the future would be flying to work all the time. So you can see there's a car sticking out of one garage. There's an airplane sticking out of the other garage. And that was supposed to be a helicopter pad at the top of the home. Maybe not the most practical thing, but I just love the almost like gonzo futurism of this thing. Like I said, this is still waiting for restoration. It is a kind of a sore sight for the eyes looking at it today, but it is one of those things that I really hope gets remodeled and gets put back into shape. Several of the homes, to answer Julie, I believe several of the homes are occupied right now. Yeah, and just to give you a sense of where we're talking about all of this, I wanted to go to a couple of quick spots on Google Maps just to highlight some of the things that we were talking about here. Let me go in and show you. I was talking about the park architecture a couple of minutes ago. Let me see if I can find really quickly here on Google Maps. Where'd it go? There we go. This is one of those things that when I spotted it last summer, I knew exactly what I was looking at here. This gate right across the entrance to the Dunes beach at the state park. And by the way, the traffic through this little single lane road on summertime days on the weekend is absolutely atrocious. It can take you hours to get back to the freeway just going down that one road from the state parks. But I love these little gatehouses because this font that you can see right here, dead giveaway. These were constructed by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, back during the Great Depression. That's when a lot of state parks using federal funds had their facilities completed, so to speak. And you still see that signature in much of the park architecture, that beach house that we saw earlier on the Dunes Beach. That's another piece of WPA architecture, if I'm recalling correctly. And then this gives you a sense of where the homes of tomorrow are located, right on Lakefront Drive. There's that wonderful bright pink Florida home. You can see just behind it, set on the bluff, this is the first house that we saw. I think this is called the Armco house. There's the home of tomorrow, still waiting renovation. It had all glass sides, and so it really got beat up by the weather. Down here is another one of our homes, and I believe the log cabin. I love the facade of this one, that beautiful artificial stone and the almost southwestern style to it. It's really beautiful stuff. The other home, the cabin, is located up on the bluff here somewhere, but I don't want to waste too much time tracking that down. The other thing I wanted to show you really quickly, I know I'm running a little short on time here. Every beach community like this usually has a town right behind it that kind of serves the tourists, the visitors that are coming in, and Chesterton and Porter played that role for the Indiana Dunes, right off the highway, located not at all far from the Dunes State Park. And I noticed an interesting ghost sign in Chesterton, Illinois. Berghoff on the side of this building on Calumet Road in the business district of Chesterton, which is quite charming. This looks like every little small town in the Midwest, these little two-story buildings with the commercial space on the ground floor, residences. I love towns like this. It's absolutely charming. But the Berghoff here immediately caught my eye because I am quite certain that is the famous Berghoff restaurant in downtown Chicago. The founder of the Berghoff, Herman Berghoff, had first founded that brewery in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It seems very likely that he still kept commercial ties, maybe shipping his beer to taverns across the state line in Indiana. And so you can still see this ghost sign indicating the Indiana connections of Chicago, one of Chicago's most famous restaurants. I love that sort of thing. It's really fantastic. All right, so we're just about out of time. I wanted to point out, I wrote a blog post about all of this last summer. You can find that on chicagodetours.com if you want to linger on some of the thoughts, some of the images that we talked about here. We got all sorts of fun talks coming up in the next couple of days here. I have a night off. I've done these 3 nights in a row, but starting on Thursday, you can come back, find me again for part 2 of our architecture crash course. We've got people, stories, food, and drink tomorrow night. Marie will be telling you about Chicago's outsider artists. I'll be talking about the earliest buildings in Chicago's history on Thursday. You can always find us on Facebook. We've got an event page lined up for all of these, so you can see the upcoming events, our Travel Tuesdays, People Stories on Wednesdays, all of that fun stuff on the Facebook page for Chicago Detours. And I want to mention right now, we, of course, always appreciate, I'm trying to figure out how to close this tab. There we go. We always appreciate support, and I'm going to paste into the group chat here in just a second. Donation information, we really appreciate that right now. Anywhere between $5 and $25 through Venmo, PayPal, Zelle just helps us keep going. I know it's not the easiest time for everybody, but that is something we highly appreciate that, and I'll paste that into the group chat if you want to use that. But if you don't want to make a donation, if you already have perhaps a review on a website like TripAdvisor or Yelp or Google or Facebook, are highly appreciated. They let the world know that we are out there. And with that, I'm going to stop our screen share. Pop back in here to the group chat. Like I said, I wanted to paste in that information about the donations to Chicago Detour if you wanted to engage with that. Give me a quick second here to do that. I saw there was a nice conversation going there in the group chat throughout the. It looked like people were kind of answering each other's questions, which is why I let myself run a little long. Plus, technical difficulties. And I wanted to mention as well, we always like knowing what topics you all might be interested in hearing about for upcoming events. So I just launched a poll in the Zoom meeting. If you want to just fill in some of the basic information there and let us know topics, other getaways you might want to explore outside of Chicago, parts of Chicago's history and architecture and culture that you might want to hear more about. We appreciate any feedback you can give us there. With all of that, if you got any last minute questions for me, feel free to fire away. And beyond that, I hope you all enjoyed yourselves this evening. I had a great time leading you around the dunes. Seeing those views from the overlooks really made me want to take a trip back there sometime soon. And of course, cheers, everybody. I hope you have a good night. Thanks, everyone.